First, let's go over the materials for the green and the yellow orchid buds. If you made the pink orchid, or if you're making the pink orchid, hang on just a second and we'll go over those materials too. Now for the green and the yellow orchid, I used the same light green bead to make those buds. Mine is an opaque pale green with a rainbow finish. Anything similar to that will give you a similar effect to what I got. Now let's talk about the wire. We're working with 26 gauge here because these are very small components. I've miniaturized this pattern. We have very small components. We don't need the thickness and the support of a 24 gauge wire. Using this 26 gauge wire is going to help us to reduce bulk on our plant and also make it look a little bit more delicate. That said, if you have a 24 gauge wire already and don't want to buy an extra spool of wire, you can go ahead and use that. It'll work just fine. It just might be a little bit thicker. The stems might be a little bit thicker and it'll be okay. Now let's talk about the colors that we used. For my green orchid, my flower petals were made in the exact same green bead as the bud sepals. And I used a 26 gauge peridot wire by Parawire. It's just it's pretty much gold with a light green cast to it. All right. Now for my yellow orchid, because my flower petals were yellow, I just chose to match with a 26 gauge gold wire. Now if you can see here on camera, the 26 gauge gold and the peridot really aren't that different in color. Both of these are going to work just fine with the light green beads for our bud sepals. So if you don't want to have to buy an extra spool just for the little couple pieces of bud sepals that we're going to be making, your 26 gauge gold wire is going to work just fine with it. It'll be just fine. Okay? Don't go out and buy an extra spool. It's unnecessary. Now these are both very light colors of wire that don't really show up extremely well on camera. So just for the video demonstration, I'm actually going to be working with a darker color of wire because I want you guys to see what I'm doing with my wire more clearly. Now let's go over the materials for the pink orchid. Now the pink orchid has a very simple shading pattern, so we have two different colors of beads. My light pink is a light pink Ceylon with an AB finish, and my darker pink is a transparent matte color-lined pink. For the wire, I used a 26 gauge hot pink wire because that's what I already had in my drawer. If you care about matching your wire to your beads, some people don't. You can use silver. I don't really care what color wire you use. Silver would work just fine if you already have it. If you already have a different kind of pink, that'll also work just fine. So use what you have that's close enough. If you care a great deal about matching your beads, rose gold is actually going to match a little bit better. I used hot pink because that's what I already had and it works just fine. Before we get started with the demo, I'm going to show you guys these spool tamers really quick. I included these in my kit, so I want to show you guys how to use them. These go around your wire spools and help to keep the wire from sproinging everywhere. So basically, there's this little plastic piece in your spool tamer, and you're gonna undo the end of your wire so it's loose, but hold on to the side of your spool so it doesn't explode everywhere while you're putting this on. So open it up, but hold on to it. Take that end of the wire and put it on the inside, through the inside of the hole on that little plastic piece, and then put your little elastic around the spool like this. And we're going to give these little ends a tighten here so that it fits fairly snugly. And of course I get one that won't go. Fairly tightly, not super tight. You still want a little bit of space to be able to pull out wire. And I'm told you're supposed to grab onto this loop and then do this, but I really don't see any difference whenever I do it. You can hold onto this little loop, pull out the wire, or just pull out the wire. Both work just fine for me there. But that's just how the little spool tamers work. I absolutely love them, so you can just pull out the amount of wire that you need at a certain time. While editing my videos that I recorded, I discovered that my light green bead really doesn't show up extremely well in the demonstration parts either, at least not as well as I'd like it to. So I'm going to re-record this with a darker color bead because I want it to be very, very clear what I'm doing to make these little sepals. Now I've gone ahead and strung some of my sepal colored beads onto the spool of 26 gauge wire. And I'm going to leave that wire attached to my spool. If you're making the solid green buds that went with the green and the yellow orchid, you can just leave your wire attached the entire time you're making the sepal. You don't need to measure and cut any wire at any point. If you are making the pink orchids, you will string your light pink beads onto the spool of 26 gauge wire, and you will work with your wire attached to the spool until we get to the point where we're going to switch colors. Alrighty, we are working with the basic frame technique. I am demonstrating the large sepal here on camera. There is also a small sepal that I'll go over after this demonstration. All right, I've just made a little loop in the end of my wire just so my beads don't fall off while I'm working. We have a 9 bead basic row, so I'm going to count out 9 beads off of my spool and bring them up so they're somewhere around an inch away from the end of my wire up here. And then to make the bottom wire, we need somewhere around 3 inches of wire. It doesn't need to be exact, but you don't want to go too much over that or you're just going to be wasting wire. So somewhere around 3-ish inches of wire. And we're going to take this wire and fold it over the front. Just cross it right there over the front of this vertical wire here, right below that basic row. So it'll look something like this. Get my fingers out of the way. I'm going to pinch and hold this working wire and the basic row together with one hand right there to hold them in place. We don't want our top wire to shrink at all. And then I'm going to twist these 2 bottom wires here, just like that. And we don't need to twist down very far because we're only making 5 rows of beads here. I'm going to straighten out my basic row by grabbing, or my basic frame here, by grabbing the top wire and the bottom loop and just pulling in opposite directions. Now, if you aren't familiar with the basic frame, let me quickly go over the parts of a basic frame. These beads right here in the center, this is row number 1 when you are counting rows. It is also called the basic row. The wire directly above the basic row, I call the top wire. It is also referred to as the basic wire in some patterns. Right below the basic row is a wire coming out. This is the wire that's going to be attached to your spool with all your beads on it. It is called the working wire, and that is what we're going to be using to wrap the remainder of the rows. This twisted wire below your basic row and the working wire, I call the bottom wire. And then there is also this bottom loop right at the bottom. Now we're ready to start wrapping rows. I've just told you that this is row number 1. So row number 1 is already done, and we're about to start row 2 here on the left side of the sepal. What I like to do is to make sure that the beads that I'm working with are nice and straight and the wire as well. So if I had any kind of wiggles or anything in my wire, just kind of run your finger along that section to help straighten it out. Now to do row 2, we're going to bring those beads up toward the top wire, and we want to make sure that this row is sitting directly beside our basic row. What we don't want is a gap like this. You're going to end up, if you have a gap like this, you're going to end up with a sepal that is an entirely different shape, and then you're also going to have a hole right in the middle of your sepal. So take a second, make sure that your rows are molded really nice and tight and close together. Now I'm working with 26 gauge wire, which bends a little bit more easily, so check your top wire to make sure that it is straight before you measure your row. We are going to be wrapping pointed top, pointed bottom, which means we need a 45-degree angle wrap. Bring your working wire over the front of the top wire. It's important that you do not go around the back. Always go over the front unless specifically instructed to do so, to go around the back. So always over the front, already at a 45-degree angle with that top wire. And then we're going to measure out our beads. We want the beads to sit either directly on top of that top wire or right in front of it. We don't want any portion of the beads to go past that top wire. And my fingers look like they're in the way here, but that's because I need to pinch and hold those rows in place. I've got one finger behind and one finger on the front. I'm just going to pinch and hold those 2 rows together. It also gives me a little bit more control over the top wire, so it's less likely to bend. Now, it might still anyways, but it just kind of reduces the amount of strain that is put while you're wrapping. All right, now I'm going to show you the 45-degree angle wrap that most people use. The one that I do is usually a little bit harder to learn, so I'm going to show you guys the one that's easier for most people first. So again, we're at a 45-degree angle. You want to make sure that you have tension on your working wire. You're not going to get a good wrap if you're trying to work with a wire that's loose and floppy. So make sure that you're holding tension. You've got the wire kind of taut here. All right, around the back and then up at a 45-degree angle. What you're going to notice here with a 45-degree angle wrap is that there's this little gap right between the bottom half of your wrap and the top half of your wrap. So right there in between those two pieces of your wrap, you've got a little gap there. That's what helps create the 45-degree angle. So make sure you've got that little gap there. And then with our wire still at that upward 45-degree angle wrap, we're going to bring beads down from the spool. And then right up here, push down to help fold that row of beads into position. And kind of take a second to make sure you're molding the top of that row into place. All right, so row 2 is finished, and now we're ready to start row 3. Row 3 is going to be wrapped at the bottom wire, and I find it easier to wrap if I just rotate my petal so that the wire that I'm wrapping around is pointed up. So again, I'm going to make sure that my bead section I'm working with is nice and straight. I'm going to hold tension on my beads so I don't get gaps forming in the middle of my row. It doesn't need to be really tight tension, just enough so that your beads are not moving around. And just like before, I'm going to fold that row of beads down toward the bottom wire and make sure that it is really tight and close against that basic row. Pinch and hold right there to give you more control and to hold the rows in place so they don't move around while you're wrapping. Bring the working wire over the front of the bottom wire at a 45-degree angle, and then measure out your beads. And again, you want to measure so that that last bead in your row is either right on top of, without going past that bottom wire, or just a little tiny bit in front of it. You also don't want to short yourself a bead, so right there that's too short because you can fit another bead there without going past that bottom wire. So if you do short yourself a bead, you're going to have a harder time getting a pointed wrap, but you're also going to have some exposed wire there where your seam is going to show. So make sure that you don't have too many beads and that you are also not shorting yourself any beads that you need to create your rows. So again, hold tension on your wire, hold your rows in place, make sure the bottom wire is straight before you wrap. We're going to go around the back, toward the front again, and up at a 45-degree angle. And again, we've got that little teeny tiny gap between the bottom half and the top half of the wrap. So there is row 3 finished, and we are ready to start row 4. I'm going to bring beads down from my spool again, make sure it's nice and straight, and then we're going to fold them down the side again to make row 4 right on the outside of row 2. Wrap up towards the top wire. Again, I'm going to make sure that my rows are really nice and tight and close together. Take a second to mold, it won't hurt anything. We're making a pointed wrap, and this time I'll do the one that I usually do. It's the same movements but in a different order. So again, come over the front of the top wire at a 45-degree angle and then measure your beads. Pinch and hold that row in place together with all the previous rows that you've made. Keep tension on your working wire. Now what I do is I go around the back and then kind of down at a 45-degree angle as I'm coming over the front. I still get that gap right between the top half, or the bottom half and the top half of my wrap, so I'm still going to get a 45-degree angle. It's the same movements, just done in a different order. I just fold my wire down before bringing the beads up is the only difference there. That way for me it's one smooth movement instead of multiple movements, but you do whatever is going to be easiest for you and your hands. Now if you're making the pink orchid, stop right here. Your last row is going to be a little bit different, so stop here or skip a couple minutes ahead and I'll show you guys how to finish your sepals. If you're doing the green or the yellow orchid, continue on with what I'm showing you here. Alright, so we're wrapping row 5, which is the last row of the large orchid sepal. And we're going to do exactly the same that we've been doing so far. Bring this row of beads down to the bottom wire. Make sure that that row is nice and close without any gaps. Make sure there are not any gaps between your beads like that. Make sure that your top wire is covered also. And if they are not, you can kind of do a little lift to make more room between the top wire and your working wire. Push the beads down and then fold it back down into place. All right, wrap down to the bottom wire, cross over at a 45-degree angle. And this time we're going to double wrap because this is the last row in our sepal. And these little wraps are really tight and close together. I don't want a gap between these. It's going to look like a little coil right there at the bottom of your last row of beads. we are going to be reducing to a single bottom wire, and right now we have 3. We have these 2 in the bottom loop, and then also a third one here with the working wire. So the first step in reducing to a single bottom wire is we're going to remove the working wire, and we're going to cut that as close as we can to where we've tied it off, right there against that little coil of wires. So just snip that off, and that will detach your sepal from the spool. I'm just going to quickly put a little loop in the end of my wire there that's still attached to my spool so my other beads don't fall off. And now we need to take these 2 wires and turn them into one. We're going to do that by, if there are any twists in your bottom wire, we need to untwist them. If they're already untwisted, you don't need to do that, obviously. All right, so you're going to see these 2 separate wires coming out of the bottom of your sepal. And we're going to cut right here, right at that same spot where we cut the working wire off, just right there, making sure that you're only cutting one wire and not both of them. All right, and that's going to open up that bottom loop and also make that bottom wire longer so that we have a long enough wire to make the stem of our orchid bud. Now the top wire on a basic frame, normally you would cut this short and fold it to the back side, but for these buds only, you're going to leave that attached and not cut and fold it. So we're just going to leave that long for now. We need this wire to help assemble our buds, so leave it attached. Now this is the large sepal. There is also a small sepal, which looks like this. The only difference is the length of the basic row. On the small bud sepal, you use a 6 bead basic row, and the large one had the 9. So we still have 5 rows of beads, pointed top, pointed bottom, and you're still going to be reducing to 1 bottom wire and leaving the top wire on there. The only difference is the length of the basic row. We are making 2 buds total for the flower stem, and each bud needs 3 sepals. So you're going to make 3 of the large sepals to make 1 large bud, and then you will make 3 of the small bud sepals to make 1 small bud. If you are making the pink bud sepals, if you followed my instructions so far, you should have the large bud wrapped up through row 4 with your light pink beads. And now at this point, row 5, is the point where we are going to switch to the darker pink color. Now to do that, we need to measure and cut wire off of the spool. And I'm just going to do that visually. I usually just wrap bare wire down the side there to estimate how much wire I need, and then go a little bit past that, so about right here, just so I have enough tail to hold on to, and then also enough to wrap. So about right there is where we need to cut off of the spool. Make a little loop in the spool end so my beads don't fall off. And then we're going to take this cut length of working wire and we're going to string the dark pink beads onto that end of the wire. That's more than what I need there. And then we're going to wrap row 5 the same as we've done before. Hold tension on the beads. If you need to, you can put a little loop in the end of your wire here, but I'm just going to hold on tight. I'm going to wrap down the side, make sure that my top wire is covered so I don't have exposed wires. And go over the bottom wire there. Make sure that my row 5 is sitting right beside row 3 and without any gaps like this, tightly and close beside. Cross over at a 45-degree angle, pinch and hold the row in place, and measure it out. And then we're going to double wrap that wire right there below the last row of beads. Now these wraps need to be tight and close together. It'll look like a little coil there right at the bottom of your sepal. And we are going to reduce to 1 bottom wire here at the bottom of our sepal. Right now we have 3. So to reduce to 1 bottom wire, we're going to cut off this working wire right there. And then we are going to untwist any twists in the bottom wire there. Spread these apart so it's a little bit easier to cut just 1 wire. And I'm going to cut just 1 of these wires right over to the side to make sure that you're being very careful and not cutting both wires, because then you're going to end up with 0 bottom wires and you don't want that. So cut right there at that same spot right below where those wires are tied off. That will open up the bottom loop, and then you can straighten it out and you've got a nice long bottom wire that we're going to be using to make the stem for our bud. Now normally with a basic frame you would cut this top wire and fold it back, but this time I'm going to cut this one a little bit shorter because I made it a little bit long. But this time we do need that top wire to still be attached to our bud. We're going to be using that to assemble the buds, so leave that top wire long. So there is the finished large pink bud sepal. For the plant that we're making, we have 2 buds. We have 1 large bud and 1 small bud. Each bud needs 3 sepals. So to make 1 large bud, you need to make 3 of these large sepals. All right, I've just shown you the large pink bud sepal. And now let's look at the small bud sepal real quick. The only difference between the large and the small bud sepal is the length of the basic row. For the small bud sepal, you're going to be using a 6 bead basic row instead of 9. You're still going to have 5 rows of beads, pointed top, pointed bottom, and you're still going to make row 5 in the darker pink color. You will still reduce to 1 bottom wire and leave your top wire attached. We are going to be making 1 large bud and 1 small bud, and each bud needs 3 sepals. So we're going to be making 3 of the large bud sepal and 3 of the small bud sepal. Normally I wait until the last lesson to do the assembly, but I figured we've already got all the pieces made, so let's just go ahead and put the buds together. Now what's going to be really helpful for you is if you have some sort of pliers. We're going to be twisting all these little top wires together. You technically can do it by hand. It's a little bit easier if you have some sort of pliers. These are just the ones I had on my desk, so I'm using these ones, but any kind of pliers that will grab and pinch and twist wires will work just fine. So you need 3 bud sepals in matching sizes for each bud. So I'm making a large bud here, so I have 3 large bud sepals. And I've got the back sides facing upward toward me. The front side, which should look like this, is going to be facing down towards the surface. We're going to take these little top wires and bend them back toward the back at a 90-degree angle. So something about like that, towards the back side of the sepal. And we're going to do that on all 3 of the sepals. And we're going to bring all of the tops of our sepals together so they kind of make a little triangular shape here. So all of our little top wires are meeting together right in the middle, touching together. Now I'm going to lift this up off the workstation. If you need to, you can clamp them down and then twist them together. I'm going to lift them up because it's a little bit easier for me to do. So I'm going to pick these up and I'm going to pinch them in my hand like this. I've got my thumb kind of right underneath where all 3 of those come together, and then my other fingers clamping on top to kind of hold them in place. And you're going to shift them around a little bit to make sure that they stay really, really close together and stay in position. We do want all of the tops of our sepals to kind of touch together. I'm going to start this off by hand because that's a little bit easier to me, and then I'm going to switch to the pliers. So I'm going to start twisting all 3 of those wires together right there, and then switch to my pliers and continue twisting. While you're doing this, you do want to twist fairly tightly, starting right there at the bottom. You want to make sure that all of your the little tops stay close together and they don't form gaps between them. But you also want to avoid twisting too tightly, or you can actually snap off those top wires. So I'm just going to pinch and twist all those little wires together, and I am going to cut this somewhat short, about right there. All right, so you'll end up with something that looks like this. Now I'm going to mold these a little bit first. I'm going to kind of just slightly curve them just by using my thumb. Just slightly curve by pressing into the back of the sepals there, not the front. And then we're going to fold all of the sepals down around that twisted top wire. So those twisted top wires are going to end up inside the bud and you won't see them. So bring those down, and I'm going to take a second here to kind of mold the top. Make sure that all of my tops kind of meet up together. Pinch right there at the top to try and close that gap as best as I can. Now I kind of mingled that bud there, so I'm going to try and fix that. Now try not to push on the outside of your bud or you're going to collapse it so that all these little sepals push inward. But it's kind of hard to do while we're assembling this, so you can always remold it a little bit as needed. So we want all of our bottom wires to meet there at the bottom of the bud. I'm going to very carefully hold right here at the bottom of my bud, and I'm going to twist all of these wires together. You can use your pliers for this if you like, but you do want to make a nice smooth twist. And I do that by making sure that my wires are all at the same angle and then twisting them together using the same pressure. That way I don't get a very lumpy twist there. Now, if you did collapse some of your sepals, some of mine did a little bit here, you can use kind of like a long, thin object and kind of stick it between sepals and then push outward a little bit to try and bring, to kind of reshape everything. All right, but you also don't want little gaps there between the rows on the sides there. So just be careful with the way that you're molding. And you can continue doing this until you get a nice bud shape. So you'll do that to all of your buds. You should have one large bud and one small bud for each flower stem that you're making. For the next part, we're going to wrap the stem with floral tape. And whenever I'm doing small components, I like to use a thinner floral tape so I get less bulk. So I've just cut a little bit of floral tape off of the spool, and I'm going to cut it in half lengthwise. This is just going to give me skinnier tape, and it makes it a little bit easier to wrap the stems without making them super thick and bulky. On some plants it doesn't matter, but this is a miniature flower and I want my stems to be fairly thin, so I'm trying to do everything I can to help reduce bulk. Now, some people would just wrap over this with embroidery floss instead of using the tape between. I like the tape between because it does help smooth out the wire, and because embroidery floss kind of slides around on wire, it doesn't hold still very well. So using floss between like this can help smooth out this stem. It'll smooth out minor bumps, but if you have any major twists in there, it's still going to show. So it's going to help smooth out my stem a little bit there, but it's also going to give something for the embroidery floss to grip to a little bit better. So I'm going to stretch the end of my tape just by pulling it opposite directions to stretch it out. That's what activates the stickiness of your tape. And then I'm going to wrap it around the stem right below the bottom of the bud and kind of stick it to itself on the other side. Now, this can be a little bit tricky to do. Sometimes it doesn't want to cooperate. Sometimes you're using the wrong side of the tape and you need to flip it over and try the other side of the tape. And then sometimes you just need to squeeze right here at the base and spin it a couple times while you're squeezing really hard. That should help to stick it down a little bit. So once you've got it stuck down, then you can angle downward so that you're always wrapping downward without a very large amount of overlap. And then you'll stretch your tape again and spin your little component and wrap tape down. You don't need to go all the way down, just a little ways. So there should just be a slight overlap as long as you've got that floral tape at an angle downward. You should only have like a little bit of overlap so the tape will stick to itself. If you're going at a wider or a flatter angle like this, you're going to end up with a much thicker stem because you're going to have a larger amount of overlap and you'll be wrapping in the same spot too many times. So make sure that your floral tape is at an angle while you're wrapping downward. Now the last part of assembling this, of prepping the assembly, is we're going to wrap this with embroidery floss. Now, if you are using, I'm using a just regular DMC floss. You can use a flat silk floss if you prefer, not the twisted kind, but a flat silk floss. So my floss is a 6-strand embroidery thread. For this part, I'm going to divide it into 2 3-strand sections. So I'm just kind of pulling it apart so I have 3 strands on each half, and then I'm going to divide it all the way down. And I did cut a couple feet off of the skein first. I'm not leaving it attached. I'm doing a very bad job here. Normally I'd put the other end in my mouth to hold it taut, but I'm trying to talk while I'm doing it, so I can't do that. Alright, so I've got my thread divided, and I'm going to use this thinner thread to wrap this stem on the orchid bud. I do this because it's not as thick, but I can get it a little bit smoother when I use 3 strands of thread. Okay, to floss the orchid stem, we're going to leave a little tail of our floss and kind of press that pointing downward towards the bottom of the stem. Just leave a little tiny tail there, and then I'm going to pinch right there below the bud sepal. That little tail we're going to wrap over as we wrap down. I'm going to pinch and hold that in place. I'm going to untwist my floss. This floss comes twisted, but it's 3 individual strands, and it can come untwisted. So I untwist it so that all three of those little strands that sit beside themselves and beside each other, instead of being a round twisted thing, that just helps give me a smoother wrap while I'm wrapping here. So I'm gonna wrap a couple times there to help secure the end. Make sure you're going down with every wrap so you don't get a lot of bulk. And once that feels secure, like it's not gonna come off when you pull, you can kind of flip it over, and I go like this. I kind of grab the bottom of my stem wire. I've got my floss in one hand, and I'm going to untwist, and then I just kind of spin the little thing, the little bud. I'm making sure that I'm going downward with every wrap. I don't want to overlap my threads here, but I do want them to sit right beside each other. And I am untwisting my floss. Every time I'm pulling out more floss to work with, I'm untwisting it to make sure that all those little threads are sitting beside each other. That's how I get a nice smooth wrap on my stems. Now for the large orchid bud, we're going to wrap down about 3/4 of an inch. It's okay if you go a little bit past, but you don't want it to be shorter than that. So about right there, this is about an inch that I wrapped down. So about right there, a little tiny bit shorter is going to be okay. Somewhere around 3/4 of an inch. And then we're going to knot the floss at the end. I'm just going to cut a little tiny piece there so it's easier to work with. And basically I'm going to loop the floss around there, create a loop on this side, and then pull the end of my floss into the loop. Make sure you're getting all 3 strands. And then pull it through the loop. And that'll just create enough of a knot that it's not going to come undone before we assemble our flower stems. If you're doing a small bud, you are going to wrap down a little bit further. We're going to wrap down to about 1 1/4 inches below that small bud.